Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Rob flying the Philippines here. Today we're going to discuss why it is that trans women cannot or should not participate in women-only sports. Before we get to that, and it is going to be a bit longer and a bit more interesting, please, we desperately need support and sponsorship and help. So please go to one of the links that I will give you and send a little something. Patreon's great. You can sponsor me on Patreon. You can just keep sending money and you won't even notice. The links are coming up in just a moment. So please go to one of them, help us out a little bit. And on with the show. Why should trans women not compete in women's sports? Now, this is something that I've had cause to think about a lot, actually, and there is a part of me, there is a big part of me that says, well, feminists really caused all the hassle and trouble we're having with gender just now, with their notion that gender was something that was not innate, that it could, and therefore it can just be changed. You know, it's just the logic of the situation. And a part of me says, hell, mend them. They've caused the trouble, let them deal with it. But I don't think that's terribly fair on the vast bulk of women, who unfortunately I think are often persuaded by feminist lies, but still, they're just ordinary women and they're decent people. And we have to try and not condemn the 90% or whatever it is of decent women with the 10% of feminist liars. You know, it's like they are moderate women, you know, and we have to respect that. Even though they are largely ineffectual at controlling the feminists, the radicals, and limiting the harm and damage that they do, the fact is they're not themselves to blame. So let's look at this question, and especially since we have the Olympics ongoing, which I'm not watching because I can't be arsed anyway, but never mind. It has come up because of this. Now, why should trans women not compete against natal women? And the answer is complex, and it will involve a discussion of a number of different topics. But the essential result, if you want to, too long didn't read, no, they shouldn't. It's just wrong. And here's why. The human male is a running machine. It's an amazing structure. We are actually astonishing. Anyone who likes football, and I suppose you Americans will call it soccer, but it's actually football, watches proper football, which is the one played by men, will be amazed, if you have any wit at all, at what you're actually seeing in terms of the way that men can accelerate, decelerate, spin, turn, jump, reverse direction, everything. Incredible. And they can do this all at speed, and they can just keep doing it. They can keep doing it. Men can run literally all the time. There are recorded examples of people running for 24 hours longer. It's really remarkable how good at running men are. And I'm not being sexist. I mean men. I mean male humans, right? Males are. It's important to understand that we are talking about males here. Why is that? Why are males, human males, so good at running? And why are human females really not very good at it at all? And they're not. The first thing we'll have to look at is a thing called variation. Now, variation exists in all living things. All organisms exhibit variation. Even organisms that have the same DNA still exhibit variation. For example, if you take an oak tree and examine its leaves, then you'll find that no true leaves on that tree are the same. They're not identical. And yet they all have the same DNA. So variation is clear there. Variation becomes much more useful and to evolution anyway, when we introduced sexually dimorphic reproduction. We're not going to go into that just now. But the point is that humans do exhibit considerable variation. So we get females with bodies that are extremely male. And for example, if we were to look at successful female runners, and I'll put up some pictures here, then we'll see that they have bodies that aren't typically female. They're more shifted towards the male. They tend to have very narrow hips and very broad shoulders. Now that doesn't mean they're not women. That doesn't mean they're not feminine. It's just that in that area, they're exhibiting a variation, right? Which happens to put them more towards the male body type, and it makes them better at running and at sports generally, right? So what's going on here? And the crucial thing to understand is, and the crux of it all, right, and this is a really important part, is the human pelvis, right? There are many ways to tell, by the way, if you're looking at a skeleton, whether you're looking at a female or a male skeleton. But the principal one, the one that's always used, and the easiest, is just to look at the pelvis. Because leaving aside our brilliant runners, people known to me personally like Liz McColgan, Yvonne Murray, people like that, exactly the same. They've got tiny little hips, big shoulders. But they're women. Leaving aside those exceptions, women tend to have a completely different shaped pelvis from men. And if you study anatomy, which I did, just after the last Dark Age, you'll see that it's normally described in two ways. The male pelvises are described as boxy, and female ones are described as bowl-like. That is shaped like a bowl. And in fact, if you see the pelvises separated from the rest of the bony structure of the skeleton, then this analogy is extremely good. It's really obvious that the female's pelvis is really a different shape from the male one. So let's look at what that means. In order to understand that, I'm just going to give you a quick lesson in mechanics. Sorry about that, folks. So if you just studied at school, you probably don't need this. But anyway, there are there are three, but we're going to talk about two forms of lever. The first is called the first class lever, and the second is called the second class lever. Now, the first class lever is the one you probably think of. When you want to shift a rock in your garden, right? You get a big pinch bar and you put a log close to the rock you want to shift, and you push down, and hey presto, the rock, which is far too big for you to lift on your own, nevertheless moves because the force that you're applying is multiplied by the lever, because the fulcrum, that's the point at which everything's pivoting, is both between the force and the load, but it's closer to the load. So that multiplies the effort. You travel more distance, but get more power, right? Now, let's consider the human body. Human bodies don't have first-class levers. They have second-class levers. And in a second-class lever, the fulcrum is at the very end of the lever, right? And the load is at the other end, but the force is applied part way along the lever. So if you consider, I'll just raise my arm right above my head here. Now if you consider the way that my arm is structured, you've got this big muscle here, right, which I can just flex a little bit, and it's actually inserted into the bone up here, but it's after the fulcrum, which is the elbow here. So what that means is that the amount of force that I have to apply to lift something, if I'm doing a deadlift like this, right, is increased. The muscle has to actually apply more force than the mass or the weight that it's lifting. In fact, many times more. So what that means is that if you consider our footballer again, running and twisting and turning, at the points of the insertions of his muscles to the pelvis, which is the bit that's holding all this together, forces of not just hundreds of kilograms, but potentially over 1,000 kilograms, measured in tons, are applied to the pelvis through the attachments. And that's why people, for example, a very common sports injury is it's called the Achilles tendon failure, which is where the muscle that holds the tendon that holds your calf muscle to your talus, the heel of your foot, actually separates, and you can't walk. That's it, you can't walk, and it's very difficult to repair. Very, very difficult. It takes a long time. These are things that footballers and other sports people really are concerned about. It's a big deal, because losing an attachment like that, and there's lots of them. Skiers, for example, get failures in their cruciate ligaments, which cause their knees to go all completely out of control, all sorts of things. And that's because of the absolutely stupendous forces that are being generated by the human body in action, right? And the boxy male pelvis is ideally adapted to controlling that and to resisting the force applied by the muscles. And remember, in humans, the two big muscles you're looking at are the big thigh muscles and the gluteus maximus at the back. And these are the biggest muscles in the body. And they are exerting tremendous force. Right. Now, the human male, because of his boxy pelvis, is basically, as I say, he's a running machine. If you look at the way force is transmitted from the lower of the foot, right up through the leg, through the pelvis to the spinal column, then you can see that this boxy shape really makes that as easy as possible. And it allows more powerful muscles to be in play, right? This is not true of females because of the bowl shape of their pelvises. That doesn't transmit the force necessary to run fast as well as a boxy one. It's as simple as that. And that is why successful female runners tend to be more masculine in morphology. They tend to have male-type pelvises. They're boxy ones. Now, why are female pelvises like that? And the answer is childbirth. Right? A baby's head, it's this big, right? And that has to come out through the aperture in the pelvis. And also, for months prior to birth, the female pelvis acts as a cradle for the developing child. And eventually it inserts its head in the appropriate place, and it's pushed through when the cervix dilates, and it has to dilate a lot, in order to pass the head. And in order to accommodate all these things, the shape of the pelvis is changed. The hips, the pivots for the two femurs, are pushed out the way, right, in order to allow this space for the baby to pass, right? It's pushed out the way, and that's what gives women that classic pear shape, which we all like. They don't tend to have slender hips. They tend to have broader hips, and narrow hipped women, not always, but quite often, will have more difficulty, right? More difficulty in delivering babies, and quite often will, because we're very good at these days, quite often they'll have cesareans, whereas 200 years ago they might well have died in childbirth. Leaving that aside. So, because of these risks, right, the pelvis in females has evolved to make childbirth as easy as possible for the female, and it's still very difficult, right? But that means that the bones are all shoved out of shape. Like I say, the hips, the pivots of the lower leg, of the femurs rather, are pushed out the way, which means that, I'll put up a picture, as you come down the legs, you get that classic reverse turn at the knee, where the leg is not straight, right? It's not Julia Roberts' legs. She's got a very masculine pelvis. They're kind of this angle, they come in and down. That's so that the feet can actually be together, right? Otherwise they'd be, apart with straight legs. So this allows them to come together. And if you remember, I don't know how many people in school do sports these days, and whether you can remember having sports days where boys ran against girls. But the fact is that the girls who were absolutely terrific at running at the age 6 and 7, and I can remember a few who showed us a clean pair of heels, by the time they were 13, 14, they couldn't run for toffee. They just couldn't run for sweetie. And when you stood behind them and watched, you would see this circular movement in the heels as they ran. And that's because they're having to pull the knees round each other, right? Because of this reverse angle, because they're knock-kneed, okay? So they don't run so well. Whereas men, The legs are straight, and the action is much more like this, which is not only much more powerful, but it's much less demanding of energy. And if that were not bad enough, we ain't finished yet. There's not that much difference between a male spinal column, vertebral column, and a female one. It's not really actually easy to tell the difference just looking at the bones. It's pretty much impossible. However, when we come up to the shoulders, we see the next big thing. And this is that males tend to have much broader, bigger shoulders. And we tend to think of those in terms of increased ability to throw things, which is true. You know, it gives you that extra power for throwing a projectile. It gives you that extra balance because you're that much broader. But the main thing is that when running, the arms actually are involved in the running process. So if you watch a runner, you'll see that they move their arms, and this actually transmits more power to the legs. So the fact of having these big shoulders where the arms are held away from the body and they're able to swing freely, just again makes men better runners. When a man needs to turn, right, and you watch football, football is an absolutely terrific game. You know, I never used to like it very much because I'm short-sighted, you know. But once I started studying it really as a sport photographer, I was like, this is amazing, you know. And if you watch the way that men turn on the ball, they turn from the shoulders. The shoulders come round. It's like a dog's tail. A dog swings its tail, its bum goes round. The man swings his shoulders and the whole lot comes after him. You know, and that's because he's got so much mass and energy tied up in his shoulders that it's actually able to swing the body like that. And believe me, watching footballers, it's really amazing because they will swing. Amazing how often they're twisting and turning, you know, and this is at speed. This is serious stuff. They're going as fast as they can. The result of all of this, right? And in fact, in men, even the head is involved in the process of running. And many studies have been done on this now. And you can measure the force increment that is given by the head moving back and forward in the run, which is transmitted down the spinal column and then to the legs. So the whole body, the whole thing, it's not just the legs, the whole thing is involved in this process of running, and the pelvis is absolutely the key. It's foundational. Now, what's interesting is, if you take your little girl of 6 or 7 and your little girl or boy of 6 or 7, they're naked, or we'll put them in swimming costumes because you know what people are like these days, you can't really tell the difference. I mean, you cover up the faces and the hairstyles. There's just no difference between the bodies. They just look the same. You know, obviously apart from the external organs, but in terms of their morphology, no, there's no difference. What does this mean? What it means is that the changes which cause the things that cause these changes in morphology happen during the process of growing up. And in fact, they happen at puberty, right? And what happens is that at puberty, under the influence of estrogen, a female pelvis begins to adopt this bowl shape and the hips get wider. And believe me, you know, I have a daughter. Plenty of my friends have daughters, and you can see it. You can actually see it over a period of years, that the girl who was, you know, at age 11 was like this, you know, skinny little drink of water. By the age 14, she looks like a woman. She's got hips, she's got a woman's body. And it's estrogen that does that, right? In the males, there's less dramatic change in the shape of the pelvis. It basically just gets older. But the shoulders and the size of the shoulder, that's formed under the influence of testosterone, right? Which, remember, women don't have, or they have, but in very small doses. So, what testosterone does is it tends to make this more masculine shape with retaining the slim hips, giving you these big shoulders, tending to make the long bones a bit longer. And it also helps to develop, because there are two types of muscle, by the way. There are two types. So one type is suited to explosive, fast release of power, and the other is suited to repetitive acting. And we both have both types. But testosterone tends to favour the explosive reaction type. which is obviously very useful if you're happening to be running around. Whereas the more cyclical, the less explosive form would be more useful for someone who is, say, walking all day, or doing this sort of thing, where it's less explosive activity, it's still expending energy, but in a slightly different way. And testosterone favours the former, whereas estrogen favours the latter, right? So where we've got now is a situation where during puberty, changes will happen to the body, which cause the male body to be better at sports, physical sports that involve things like running and jumping, twisting, turning, swimming, that sort of thing, than the female one. And we know this is a fact because that's why we have female-only sports. They've already passed through the critical period of puberty, right? The males will already have those boxy pelvises adapted for running and twisting and jumping, right? And the females won't. It's really that simple. Now, Martina Navratilova actually mentioned this a few months ago, about 6 months ago now, in an interview, and she said that it's just unfair for any person who's gone through a male puberty to compete against females. And she's right. She is 100% right. It is completely unfair to do that because they went through that puberty. Whether you like it or not, it doesn't matter what type of trans woman you are, whether you're homosexual, non-homosexual, whatever you want to call it, you're going to have gone through that puberty. It might be perhaps a little bit attenuated in the case of HSTS, that is true transsexual, but the fact is, you're still going to have a boxy pelvis, something approximating the standard male shape. And if you're a person who came along later, you're a non-homosexual and you transition maybe when you're 17 or 18 or even later, you're going to have a full male skeleton, right? You're going to have the full Monty, the full works, right? Which gives you all the advantages of the male frame. And to an extent, at this point, the level of testosterone in your blood doesn't actually matter very much because you've already got the structure that you need to win. This is compounded because, in fact, when our standard WPATH guidelines, which are largely appropriate, quite clearly state that boys should get puberty blockers. Appropriate boys, right? And this diagnosis is complicated and takes a long time. They should be getting puberty blockers from around age 13 to 16, and only then do they get feminizing hormones. Right, so they ain't going to develop a bowl-shaped pelvis. They're just going to develop the standard male pelvis. Simple as that. There's nothing there. They may have slightly reduced upper body bony structures. Doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference. The point is that the people who tend to be those athletes who tend to wish to compete against females and who are trans are not normally of that type. They're of the later transitioning type. They're of what we call the non-homosexual AGP type, right? And they don't appear until after puberty. That is, until all of the changes in their body have already taken place, right? And so in their cases, what hormones are doing is just adding fat where it might help them look a bit better, basically. They're still going to be extremely good or better than the average woman at sport and running. I'm sorry, it's that simple. And there's no way to get around that one. You can't. Cutting down the amount of testosterone in the blood does not undo the bony development that's already there. It can't. Those bones are there. That pelvis is the shape it is. And as a male type, boxy, sporting pelvis, is just better at this stuff than the average female one. Now, yes, I know that we get, because we've already mentioned it, we get variation, and that, yes, very good top-level female runners tend to have skeletons that are a bit more, they're kind of shifted towards the male. They have narrow hips, they have very long femurs, they tend to have longer legs generally, they're much more powerful and tight gluteus maximus, and they tend to have very broad shoulders, right? Because those are the things that make you good at running. But that's natural variation within a female phenotype, right? That's not a male type. It's a female type, it just happens to appear to be more like the male type, right? So if you were to say to someone who transitioned at the age of 19 or 20, oh, it's all right, you can compete with the girls, you're absolutely putting them at a disadvantage. You're disadvantaging the women. And as I say, for a very long time, I was a darn feminist, hell mend them. But at the same time, that's just not fair. It's not fair on all the women who spend, all the females, right, who spend years training and basically overcoming the disadvantages that their bodies naturally do have. You know? I can tell you from experience, you know, I mean, I've seen Sam run, and she's like greased lightning. You know, I mean, women just, even women taller than she is, and she's not very tall, I mean, she just leaves them for dead. If it's a bit of fun running, she's gone. And that's because she has that boxy pelvis. You know, that all the energy that she's able to generate in her running, it's all put to good use. And it's because of that structure right in the middle of the body, the pelvis, that she has, that women don't have. I mean, females here tend to have very markedly bowl-shaped pelvises, and they're just terrible at running. Hopeless. You know, people do it for fun, you know, and it's not a serious thing. But yeah, Sam is very proud of her running ability, and I think it's fair to say that most trans women, HSTS or otherwise, are going to be pretty slippery when it comes down to it. And don't take that in a rude way. People have got such dirty minds, honestly. They're going to be pretty slippery, and they're going to be slippery in a way that it's not. It's an unfair advantage over females. And so I have to say, after a considerable amount of thought about this, because I'm always trying to be as fair as I can to trans women, that no, it isn't fair. Your bodies are, unless you, and this just never happens, you know, unless you actually transitioned at the age of 8, and it doesn't happen, this just doesn't happen, that's a scaremongering thing from the United States. It doesn't happen. WPATH forbids that sort of thing. There's no way. You will have passed through a male puberty, right? That means your skeleton will be naturally better adapted to these kind of sports than a female one. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's a fair advantage, because that's not like, you know, the advantage given by, you know, years of training and maybe just natural ability, that sort of thing. Not the same. It's an unfair, unnatural advantage. Perhaps, possibly, we could figure out some kind of handicapping system that would try to make this more equitable for everyone, so that there was less of a marked advantage for those with male skeletons. But I know what would happen. I know that the trans lobby would go absolutely apeshit over it, right up in the air, and say, you know, you're just discriminating against us again. I'm sorry. I think we do have to make a choice here. And are we going to make a choice to discriminate against females, which is what allowing trans women to compete in female sports actually is, or are we going to, you know, unfortunately have to say to the trans women, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that. I think the number of HSTS, that's true transsexuals, who want to compete in sports is pretty slim anyway. You know, I mean, they might do it for a bit of fun, but they're not really usually the kind of people who would want to have a career, you know, in sport. Bit different for the non-homosexual AGP type. I mean, goodness gracious me, consider what you've got in the United States. You've got the United States national women's football team. They call it soccer because it's America. Cultural imperialism never stops. They call it soccer, but it's actually women's football. What would happen if all of the players on that team were actually late transitioning, or what's called adolescent adult transitioning AGPs, what would happen? They would be as good as men. As simple as that. They would actually be men. And I think that's something that we have to take into account. I think that the whole issue has raised ethical matters that we actually need to deal with and have not thus far been able to deal with. I'm sorry, the dog is barking. This is probably the point at which I'll have to wrap it up. So, for the time being, and for me, Rod Fleming, take care, and I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, because I thought about this a long time. I simply cannot see my way clear to saying that it's acceptable for trans women who went through male puberty to compete in female sports. Sorry, can't see it, can't do it. Bye-bye.